Thanks everyone for coming. This is a magnificent turnout in a magnificent building on such a beautiful day as well. So thank you for giving up your time. And I'm amazed by this interest, if I'm being perfectly honest, in an acronym. I work at Friends of the Earth on economics, and we were looking at TTIP about a year ago, wondering what sort of interest we'd be able to whip up about it, and we weren't entirely sure people would care. Well, it looks like people care, and this is an absolutely fantastic opportunity to explore the issues a bit more. And I'm wondering why it is that people care so much. And I think there's something very interesting going on in our political debate at the moment, and TTIP has come along at a very, very interesting time. Maybe it's because TTIP is thought to be secretive or controversial, and at a time when people are asking what's politics for, that's really tapping into something. There's a time of increasing distrust in vested interests, weariness with austerity, punch and judy politics, possible end of two-party politics in the UK. And for the first time in ages, it looks like there's a genuine left versus right debate happening in our politics, which personally I think is quite a healthy thing to be happening. There's a growing sense also that economic growth is not necessarily delivering for everyday people. Where people's real wages haven't been getting any higher, the 85 richest people in the world have as much money as the 3.5 billion poorest people. And all of this is sloshing around, and then along comes TTIP. Our supporters can't get enough of it. You guys are fascinated by it. I know that MPs are bombarded with questions about it. I know that journalists are too. And so we're here to talk about it with seven people who are going to give you their views on what TTIP is. I'll introduce them in a second, but I'll just very quickly, you've had the film, so I can really cut down the blurb I was going to give about what TTIP is, just to be absolutely clear about acronyms and get it out there. TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. TTIP, TTIP, it's a horrible clunky name. No one's been able to come up with anything snappier, so TTIP it is. If you have a better name, we'll hear it afterwards, I'm sure. What it's designed to do, its supporters say, is remove barriers to trade between the EU and the US, make it easier to buy and sell goods, make it easier to invest in each other's economy. Its supporters say that by 2027 it will deliver benefits of 200 billion euros for Europe, or 10 billion pounds for the UK per year, and it will drive jobs and prosperity. Its opponents, of which there are many, say that these benefits are theoretical, perhaps overstated, and that the last thing people on the planet need is what looks like less regulation, more power to big business at a time of a climate crisis, public service crisis. And there's a particularly controversial aspect around it, which we will talk about today. It's not the only part of it, around this thing called ISDS, secret courts, what George Monbiot has called a gunpowder plot against democracy this week, where companies who think they're denied trade in one or the other can sue governments in unaccountable courts, or at least that's what's claimed. But one of the reasons why this is so controversial is very little is really known about the ins and outs of what's going on and what's being debated. It's being debated mostly in private, and this is what makes for such an interesting discussion about what's actually going on. And you have to think, the last thing I'll say is you have to think, in thinking what you think about TTIP, about what you think about some really big questions. What do you think about regulation versus business? What do you think about free trade? What do you think about what our economy is for and who gets to benefit from the proceeds of growth? What do you think about growth? All of these questions are really behind, I think, what draws so many people to be interested in an acronym and a trade deal. So I'll introduce the panel one by one. Starting on my right, we have Charlotte Leslie, Conservative MP for Bristol North West. Says here that she used to work as a special advisor to Shadow Education Secretary David Willits. She's formerly edited Crossbow. She's written for a number of publications, including The Telegraph and The Times. Anything you want to add to that, Charlotte? No, that's what I was about. Yeah, very good. To her right, Stephen Williams, Liberal Democrat MP for Bristol West, the first ever Liberal MP for that constituency, the first Lib Dem to be elected in Bristol since 1935. He's a communities minister in the Department for Communities and Local Government, and he's also served on Avon County and Bristol City Councils. To his right, Molly Scott Cato, the new Green MEP for the southwest of England. New Green MEP for the southwest of England. Professor of Economics, PhD in Economics, PPE at Oxford. She sits on the Agriculture and Economics Committees in Brussels. To her right, Kerry McCarthy, MP for Labour, Bristol East, who's been a lawyer, and she has been a member of the Treasury Select Committee while in government, and is now a shadow Foreign Office Minister following a shadow cabinet reshuffle a few years ago. She's been holding that job for about 3 years. To her right, we have Nigel Costley from Southwest TUC. He's been the Southwest Regional Secretary of the TUC since 1996 and looks after basically everything that happens on employment in Southwest. So he's the man to talk to about jobs. If you've lost your job, it's basically Nigel's fault.
If only.
Next to Nigel is Fran Boait from Positive Money. She's the executive director there. Positive Money, Fran will maybe explain very briefly when she talks. Not-for-profit organisation looking at the money system, democratising money and banking to work for society and not against it. And she's very humble about such things, but she also has a PhD in climate change mitigation as well, so she knows her stuff. And last but definitely not least, on my far right, Sam Lowe, my colleague from Friends of the Earth, who has a Master's in Conflict Governance, International Development, and has cut his teeth, perhaps quite literally, working in Greenland with affected communities in the gemstone industry over there. So he leads Friends of the Earth's work on TTIP and trade. My job is to be entirely neutral. If you want Friends of the Earth's views on things, Sam is the person to give it. We've got a big panel. We're going to crack on. A couple of things to note. The MPs are who you're really here to listen to, and MEP. Forgive me, Molly, MPs is a shorthand for MPs and MEP. So the questions are mostly going to be directed at them, but I'll ask the guys on the right to come in as you think you need to. We have had loads of questions come in from the box that was outside and are coming in live on Twitter. The bunnies over here are going to be passing me questions as we go on. I'll be doing all the questions from here, so we won't have questions from the floor, but do come along afterwards and mingle and ask questions, as Tim pointed out, for a glass of wine if you want to discuss in person. It's the only way we could make such a big event work, is to have questions coming in live. There is a Twitter handle which you can see up there, Briz TTIP. So although your phone should be on silent, please, if you are tweeting, Mike will pick those up over there. So if you want to ask questions during the event, they will go over to Mike. And we have an hour and a half, of which I've banged on already for 10 minutes. So I'm going to start my little timer now. All right. So, first question. So the first question, is anyone changing these slides, Julian, or are we doing okay, it's staying up there, right. First question is quite simple. I'm going to give each of the panel a chance just to tell us, nice and briefly, what they think of TTIP. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I guess we may as well just go along, starting with Charlotte to my right, if that's okay. So Charlotte, TTIP, good thing or bad thing?
Well, I'm going to be naughty. I'm going to start with a question of the audience. And I want you to put up your hand if you've got a mobile phone which you're using here today. Now, put up your hand if you're wearing clothes that you have actually made. I can knit, but not this well. Congratulations to those who have. Put your hands up if you're a bit worried about how much Christmas is going to cost. You'll find out. So no one's concerned about how much Christmas is going to cost. You're all sorted. Yeah, there's a couple there. Well, I don't want to come round to yours for Christmas because it's not going to be very much. Now, the reasons that I've asked these slightly unrelated questions is because...
Excuse me, I'm going to have to insist that we try and keep interruptions from the floor down. It's disrespectful to the panel, if you don't mind. Yeah, well, let's
what
not...
I'm trying to
2 minutes
illustrate
in, let's not shout from the floor. Thanks very much.
Is that phones, clothes that we haven't made, things that we're wearing are a result of trade. And I think what's very interesting about the TTIP debate is it's a question of what do we want trade to be? Where do we want trade to be in our lives? And I think it is an interesting debate that is dividing people, as we can see, because the hall's very, very full. Now, I understand that lots of people in the audience aren't going to agree with me on this, but I am for trade. But I am for trade with the right regulations in place. I think there's often a mistake made that lots of regulations equals good regulations. I think one of the things that contributed to the failure of capitalism in the financial crash, not that there were too few regulations, but actually there were too many, and they were too complex, and they gave establishments places to hide. So the natural regulators, if you had a free market, such as actors taking the risk on themselves, didn't apply. So you had the people who caused the problem not carrying the consequences of the problem, and other people carrying those consequences. So I think the TTIP debate is a very interesting one. I am in favour of trade. I know a lot of people will disagree, but trade with the right regulations. Now, one of the limitations on this debate is we don't know what the agreement will look like yet. When we do, we can look at that negotiated regulations. And just a word of comfort, if you like. When the trade agreement has been formulated, it's going to have to be agreed by 28 member states of the EU. Now, the EU is known for many things. Whizzing through regulation, it is not. So I think we're going to have a big opportunity to discuss this for a lot more time yet.
Thank you.
Oh, give us a clap.
There's just before Stephen comes in, we've got an hour and 20 minutes to exhaust everything that the panellists think about TTIP. So let's not be jumping in just yet with things she hasn't said. We'll do that later, maybe. Stephen.
Well, I'm in politics for a variety of reasons. My main domestic reason for being in politics is I think Britain is an unfair place, and I want to deal with social inequalities, particularly where they derive from health and education. But the other main reason why I'm in politics is because I'm an internationalist. I'm a liberal internationalist. I believe that as the world gets more complicated, as the challenges that we all face get ever more urgent to deal with, we achieve much more by working with each other as peoples, as countries, as continents, than we do by being insular and divisive and believing that all of the world's solutions can be dealt with in Britain alone. So that's why I'm passionately in favour of Britain being within the European Union and staying within the European Union and playing an incredibly positive role inside that union, which I think has been the most successful example of multinational cooperation in global history. And it's something that we should all be pleased about, the fact that we can travel around Europe, we can trade around Europe, we can work around Europe, and neither my generation, my father's generation, if I had them, my children's generation, have never had to contemplate taking up arms against each other because of disputes over trade and so on. The European Union is the world's largest single market. We are part of the most powerful multinational club on the entire planet. It is the one area where we have the upper hand over the United States of America. And I believe the world forward for the planet is through peace, is through trade, rather than through arms and dispute where the United States has the upper hand. So the first thing to say, when a lot of people have said this is sort of a democratic outrage, is a threat to our liberties, a threat to our public services, a threat to all sorts of things, is perhaps we ought to have a little bit more confidence about where we are and what our place is in the future of the world. And as Charlotte just said, when this treaty does eventually come to a point where it needs to be discussed by your elected politicians, it will have to be passed by 28 states as varied as Latvia and Ireland, Britain and France, in order to get through. It also need to be approved by President Obama, who I'm guessing most of this audience think is a reasonable person, and the United States Senate. Well, the fact that some people don't tells me something. Well, it will have to be passed by the United States Senate as well. So it's probably going to be, since the formulation of the United Nations, probably the biggest thing the planet has done. That's going to be the most heavily scrutinized thing that world leaders have done together that we've ever seen. I think trade, working with each other, trading at what we're best at with what other people are best at, is the way that the planet has advanced in a peaceful way. I think, obviously, there are details we will have to be looked at, but I start, as I often do in politics, from a position of optimism rather than deep pessimism and cynicism.
Molly, please, what do you think? Is TTIP a good or a bad thing?
Thank you very much. The Green Group in the European Parliament is leading opposition to TTIP, and it was a key focus of my campaign during the European elections. It was actually quite difficult to get much attention at that point for the reasons that David was talking about, and I'm really glad that 38 Degrees and other campaign groups are raising the profile of this, because it's my view that once people find out what it's about, they will oppose it. And I think the view in the room today is proving that, and that's why the negotiations were kept secret. At Westminster, Caroline Lucas, our only MEP, put down an early day motion on this last year, and she got the support of 38 MPs. So even in the parties of the people sitting here, not everybody thinks TTIP is a good thing. Now, I think the reasons for opposing it will come out as we go on, so I won't spend very much time on them, but I recommend a website that the European Green Group's running called ttip2014.eu, and this is the leaflet that you can find there. So the key reasons are a race to the bottom on standards. I've opposed this from the start because I could see who was behind it, and it was the multinational corporations who want to reduce standards. If you think they're all going to sit in a room and suddenly say, well, we're going to improve our standards of environmental protection or the protection we offer workers at work, then okay, this might be something to go forward with, but I'm afraid I just don't believe that's where they're coming from. And in the lobbying meetings before the negotiations take place, 93% of those meetings were with corporations rather than citizens groups. So that tells me where the impetus is coming from for TTIP. We also have to worry about the privatisation of public services and the way that plays into the ISDS proposals. So effectively, the government, the coalition government now has opened up the market for the privatisation of the health service, and TTIP will ensure that US corporations can come in and take over those markets. The secrecy is a great problem, and it's something we're opposing in Europe. But to be honest with you, I think if it came out into the open, we would see the problems with the treaty and then opposition would grow. So I'm not convinced that we're going to get the openness we're calling for. And that's why the process by which the decision takes place is really important. So Charlotte and Steve have implied that there'll be a nice long process to consider this as if it was at Westminster, but that's not how trade treaties happen at Europe. The negotiations will happen in secret, and then right at the last minute we'll be forced to make a decision very quickly. And so I don't think there is a proper open and democratic process. So I think we need to stop it now, and we are doing everything we can to do that.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Molly. So, Kerry, same question. TTIP, good or bad?
Okay, huge topic, obviously. I agree with what Stephen said about internationalism. You know, I'm a shadow foreign minister. I cover Latin America and most of Asia, so I spend a lot of time actually trying to cement our relationships, whether on a bilateral basis or on a regional basis, with other countries. And I think that international agreements do have the power to lift standards to an extent. If you look at the extended EU with the new accession countries coming in, we want to raise standards in countries like Poland. We want to raise wages. We want to raise health and safety standards. I'm sure Nigel will have something to say about workers' terms and conditions. And by locking them into agreements, environmental standards, for example, animal welfare, there's the potential to do that. Having said that, I'm very much aware that there is huge concern that the treaty will not lift standards across the board, but it will lower them. Environmental standards. I was in El Salvador recently with Christian Aid looking at the impact of climate change. And one of the things that really concerned me when I met with farmers there, they have Central American Free Trade Agreement with the US. And there's concern that exactly as we've heard in the film, that Monsanto is able to come in and say to El Salvador, no, you must take our GM crops. They've got this native seed project where they're trying to basically go back to organic, sustainable farming, which I think is absolutely brilliant thing. The idea that a company like Monsanto could come in and challenge them in the courts, there's 2 court cases going on at the moment saying, no, you will take our pesticides, you will take our GM crops. I think that is totally and utterly wrong, and that is... And also, as you'd expect, you know, I've been vegan for something like 23 years. You'd expect me to be very concerned about animal welfare standards. America has lower animal welfare standards than Europe. There's concern, actually, that even within the EU, some of the countries aren't meeting the standards that are required of them. So, again, I would want to see the agreement lift those standards and put an obligation on them. The labour conditions, America hasn't signed up to the ILO terms and conditions. I'll probably leave that to Nigel to talk about. Again, that's something that's important. But the final thing, well, there's two things I want to say very quickly. ISDS, my understanding is that they probably won't end up in the final treaty because there is so much opposition from countries like Germany. So I'm sure we'll get onto that in more detail afterwards. The big thing that Labour's been campaigning on is about the NHS. Andy Burnham has been over to Brussels. We've had certain assurances that a government could, if there's a monopoly on a public service, that would be exempt from TTIP. Our concern is that with the privatisation of the health service that's already begun, we won't be able to turn the clock back, and those privatised elements of the health service under the government's recent health and social care bill would then be subject to TTIP. So there's been assurances on the NHS, but we're not happy, and we certainly wouldn't support it if we felt that the NHS was endangered.
Thank you, Kerry. So, Nigel from the TUC, what's your views?
Thank you. Well, it's fantastic to see so many people here talking about an international trade agreement that it could be another year away. But trade unions generally here and in America and across the European Union are in favour of trade and by and large in favour of positive trade agreements. But you cannot separate this debate from the context that we're living and working in, and that is, particularly in the last 30 years, the rise of corporate power determined to squeeze wages and restrict workers' rights across the world, to limit and enmesh our public services, and particularly to privatise them. And we've seen this massive gulf in inequalities develop. So as the secret talks have unfolded, and gradually we've been able to shine a bit of light on what is going on with TTIP, then trade union movements, particularly in America and Europe, are becoming increasingly alarmed. And at our Congress in September, we, as a British trade union movement, took a step further and said, actually, although we would like to see certain elements of a trade agreement, not this one, and we are calling for it to be opposed and halted.
Nigel, thanks. So, Fran, what's the positive money view? Is TTIP a good or a bad thing?
Okay, thanks for inviting me, and really good to see everyone. Thanks for coming on a Saturday. It's really exciting to have so much energy in the room. So I've been asked to talk about the financial sector part, and TTIP is really about removing barriers to trade, deregulation and liberalising various sectors, including the financial sector, which is a big part of it. And, you know, we're 6 years after the biggest global financial crisis, and I disagree with Charlotte and say that did happen due to kind of 20 years of deregulation and liberalisation of that sector. And just so you know, I'm not the only one that thinks that. Here's a quote from our current Governor of the Bank of England, who said light touch regulation contributed directly to the financial crisis. So it seems to me, like, how come we're still thinking that further deregulation and liberalisation is the answer when clearly it's not? And the main people advocating for financial sector to be a big part of TTIP, people saying that it will be great because it will make the financial sectors even bigger. When actually we know, I mean, there's hundreds of academic studies, and we know intuitively we've got a financial sector that's out of control and it's too big already. And it's actually so big that it's extracting wealth and resource from the rest of the economy. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what Positive Money does. It's great to hear that quite a few of you might have heard of us, but we're still quite a new organisation and quite a radical financial reform organisation. Basically, we're trying to raise a debate around who creates and allocates our money, because we think that should be a national conversation. So we kind of start from the point that not many people know how money's created, and that was kind of clear after the financial crisis. And in fact, we polled 100 MPs this July to see if they knew how money's created. So I don't know whether any of these MPs were in that poll, but basically it showed us that over 70% think that money is money creation in the UK and in all of the countries is controlled by the government, and they're the only institution that has the power to create money. When in fact the government via the Bank of England and the Royal Mint have control of only 3% of all the money we use, and that's money in the form of cash and coins. And the rest, the 97%, is in the form of digital money, and that is all created by corporations, by banks when they make a loan. So we have a situation where basically banks get to create all of our money and they get to allocate it where they want. And obviously that has a huge effect on the economy. But we also have a situation where a lot of our elected representatives don't understand this system and this problem. And I'd say it's not that dissimilar from TTIP as well. There's a real deficit in kind of what is TTIP about. And so one thing that we're doing is on the 20th of November, there's going to be a debate in Parliament for the first time in 170 years on money creation and whether actually we should let corporations create our money and lend it to us, or potentially we should actually renationalise that power.
Thank you, Fran. So last, Sam from Friends of the Earth. Is TTIP a good or a bad thing?
Hello, thanks for all being here. I must say I've been doing these sort of events and speaking at them for maybe the last 6 months, and this is by far the biggest crowd I've ever seen at a TTIP event. And I've been doing them in London, around the country, so well done, Bristol. I mean, even my parents are here, so yeah. So the question, is TTIP a good or a bad thing? I mean, the next question I asked instinctively is for who? Is it a good thing for the short-term profits of multinationals, for small business, jobs, people, planet, economy at home, as a whole, the environment? I think the answer to all of those questions is very different. However, I'm really glad Stephen brought up the international community side of it, because I'm going to focus on just one aspect now. I would say the biggest challenge facing the international community right now is the biggest market failure of all time, climate change. So, my question then is, and what I'm going to look at now, is how is TTIP going to affect the climate? And later on I'll focus on all the other stuff as well, because I do talk about it more broadly. So, we know that we're on course to be pretty much wiped out unless we do anything. So, what does TTIP do? Well, from the European Commission's own studies, we know that it's going to raise greenhouse gas emissions in the EU and US. This study is limited, and it's only by a small amount, but the direction of travel is incredibly worrying. Additionally, we know that one of the key objectives for Europe from this agreement is to get the US to remove their 40-year ban on exporting crude oil, and also to remove their restrictions on the export of liquid natural gas. We know this because they've been very explicit about it, and the former Trade Commissioner, Karel de Gucht, was explicit and said he cannot foresee an agreement without these provisions. What does this mean? It means another 15 to 20 years of fossil fuel intensive infrastructure and the development of this at a time when we are meant to be weaning ourselves off fossil fuels. Why would we ever dream of committing to more fossil fuel intensive constructions and projects? I have no idea. And additionally, this would facilitate the import of tar sand oils from Canada, refined in the US, over to the EU. And they say that people have been saying this is going to lead to greater regulations. We've already seen the impact that trade has on regulations, because the Fuel Quality Directive in the EU, a specific directive to address the greenhouse gas emission of fuels we use in our cars, has already been weakened as a result of Canadian and US lobbying to accommodate the tar sands to be exported from Canada and from the US. How can they say that regulations are going to stay the same when we've already seen the impact this agreement can have? I'm going to wind up with a quote, actually, from my favourite environmentalist, Margaret Thatcher, who 25 years yesterday said, as part of a speech to the United Nations General Assembly advocating action on climate change, she said this: "As we travel through space, as we pass one dead planet after another, we look back on our Earth, a speck of life in an infinite void. It is life itself, incomparably precious, that distinguishes us from other planets. It is life itself, human life, the innumerable species of our planet that we want only destroy. It is life itself that we must battle to preserve." So I'm going to finish with a question. If, as predicted, TTIP is incompatible with our economic, environmental and moral imperative to collectively reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, to win this battle for life itself, why on earth would we ever want TTIP?
Thank you very much. So we're going to explore all of that in a great deal more depth, pithily, in the next 55 minutes or so. We're going to move on to the next section. What's happening is Julian is passing me up questions. If I have time within the various sections, I'm going to ask them, but in this case, we're just going to move on to the next one, and they'll come up when they come up. This is moving into the next section here, and it's about regulation versus business. And it's a question, I think this has been put into the box outside, or it might have come on Twitter, I'm not sure. If this is your question, give us a whoop. But the question is quite simple. Is pro-regulation anti-trade? So that's the question. Is it, if you are in favour of regulation, are you opposed to trade? So what I'm going to do with this next section, I'm going to ask the MPs in particular. I'll expect them to say something unless they really feel they don't need to. So would anyone like to go first? Charlotte, can I turn to you first?
Draw the short straw.
Yep. I promise I won't come to you first again.
I thought I was going to be the first one to mention Margaret Thatcher if it was all getting really horrible and I was going to yell it and then run out the back and hope you didn't notice. But well done. I don't think it is. I think, to use an analogy, I get frustrated when people talk about should we have a big state or a small state. I'm not so fussed about the size as long as it does its job well, and I think there's a phrase called a smart state for that. And I think regulation's the same. I think sometimes it's easy to pump out loads of regulation just because you've got loads of regulation to kind of think you've done the job, whereas actually what you need is very clever, tight regulation. So I think in a society where we don't want the winners just to run away, tilt the playing field so they're no longer competing on an even playing field, and we want to maintain equality of opportunity, I do think you need regulation, but I think you need very well thought through right regulation, which is not something politics has always been very good at. But I don't think being pro-regulation is being anti-trade.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. I will go right to left. I won't do that next time, but Stephen, would you like to come in?
Well, I believe in free trade, which actually means, before anyone makes any assumption, that I believe that artificial tariff barriers, which are protectionist measures designed to protect particular producers, in Iowa, for instance, we're about to get into the American political season, now the midterms are over, and I'm sure American presidential candidates are making all sorts of promises to farmers in different parts of the states that they're going to stop Europeans exporting stuff to them and by maintaining tariffs. So I'm in favour of free trade and products being decided upon by all of you and all of us as to whether you want to buy them based on their merits rather than tax barriers being put in the way. But free trade does not mean, absolutely does not mean, no regulation. In fact, free trade requires there to be regulation, because without regulation about labelling, about standardization of components, you can't have that big single market within the European Union for which we all as consumers benefit from, and we can't have the bigger single market that may happen if we have this trade agreement. Just on something like labelling, for instance, there may be identical products made by companies on both sides of the Atlantic, but because of different labelling requirements, can't be sold across the Atlantic. That's clearly nuts. We may want labelling of goods that come from a particular part of the world. I'm in favour of clear labelling of goods that come from illegal settlements, for instance, in the West Bank. So we may have an opportunity to get that agreed right across the European Union and in America. Free trade does require regulation. That may seem like an oxymoron, but that's actually true.
Thanks, Stephen. Molly,
Okay, I've just really confused about that, because if you have the same goods in different countries that are on opposite sides of the world, why would you swap them? I mean, that's just not making sense to me. I don't think there is necessarily a contradiction between regulation and trade. I think you could have more trade which was well regulated, but I think in the context of this debate, the important concept is what's called harmonisation, Because in order to have a single market in the European Union that stretches and includes the US market as well, you have to have the same standards. That's what they mean by harmonisation. And the real question is whether those same standards will be lower or higher than the ones we've got now. And I'm totally convinced, I agree with Nigel here, that what the corporations are doing is trying to harmonise on lower standards. And that's the most important threat from TTIP. We hear a lot about free markets and free trade, but these markets are not free. They're dominated by massive corporations. We see less and less real competition between companies because companies get swallowed up by other companies until you have a really small number of players in these global markets. And what they're trying to do now is to bully politicians so that they're controlling the way those markets work, and they're not going to work in our interests. I just want to point out some of the ways in which European standards are higher. So, for example, we fought in the European Parliament to end the process of sow stalls so that piglets, when they're born, are kept away from their mothers. We fought to remove a lot of pesticides from agriculture, so the neonicotinoid pesticides that have killed bees. And all the time when we're fighting for this, often as the Green Group, the corporations are fighting in the opposite direction. And they're fighting now against pesticide regulation. We don't even have the new regulation, and already they're fighting us over that. So that's the sort of pressure we're up against. And that's why it's brilliant to see a room full of people here standing up for the animals and standing up for much better standards of production in agriculture and in our economy generally. I just want to say a quick word about the mobile phones. Charlotte started off with the mobile phones. Well, every mobile phone has certain minerals in it, and those minerals are often produced in zones of conflict. So there's a whole debate about conflict minerals. And my colleague, Judith Sargentini, who's a Green MEP from the Netherlands, has been fighting to make sure that companies cannot use minerals taken from conflict areas in the production of phones. But again, that's something where the other groups in the Parliament are opposing us. Why are they doing that? Why can't we have the highest possible standards of phone manufacture? And I would say to Kerry, I completely agree with her. She's outlined the case for the race to the bottom. So if that's her view, why don't the Labour Party just tell their MPs to kill this now? If the Socialists and Democrats... If the Socialist and Democrat group in the Parliament came out against it, it would be killed dead. So that's my challenge to her.
Okay, well, to look to the point that Molly has just made, it does come back to whether this is indeed a race to the bottom or whether we can use trade negotiations to lift up standards, as I've said, whether it be health and safety, whether it be animal welfare protection, whether it be labour standards. One of the points I don't think I made in the introductory bit was that it's very important that the negotiations that are going on now are far more transparent because, as has been said, each individual parliament will have to ratify this and the EU will have to ratify it, but that could come quite close, at the end of the process. I think it's important that we have input into the negotiations now and that we can actually carve out what is and what isn't in the agreement. So rather than just relying on assurances that this won't affect the NHS, for example, we need something very specific on the table that absolutely confirms that position and confirms it whether or not the NHS is further privatised or not. I agree with Molly's point about sustainability, and I think that there is a tendency of a race for trade's sake, which is linked to overconsumption and overexploitation of the world's resources. If you look at, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but I think it's something like about 90% of the toys that will be sold here at Christmas are being shipped all the way from China, and most of them will end up in the bin by Easter. I think that sort of overconsumption is absolutely insane, and also the pressure that it puts on people to have to spend money on those things. Having said that, we've got a 30 billion trade deficit in the UK, and there are things that we can trade that aren't... If you look at Ardman, for example, in Bristol, that is all part of trade, selling things like our animation services, our creative industries, the Natural History Unit, the BBC... makes a huge amount of money out of the Natural History Unit selling its films abroad. That is all part of international trade. It doesn't have to be about this sort of very disposable, cheap items that are sort of manufactured and use up lots of resources. So I think there is an argument for increasing trade. The deregulation issue, I mean, ironically, the US is actually one of the most protectionist countries going, and this agreement could help us sort of remove some of the US protectionism that means that they don't allow other people to trade in their markets. I think there is sometimes a case for protectionism. I think actually it was War on Want that did the big banana campaign a few years ago, where there are certain countries, former colonies, where they've become monocrop countries. So it was all about the banana campaign. With liberalisation, a country like the Dominican Republic, which had actually got rid of all its sustainability, all its the sort of agriculture that enabled them to look after themselves in exchange for just growing bananas, which they sold overseas and then got the income from that. With liberalisation then, they were opened up to competition from Latin America, and the whole economy was about to collapse because there wasn't that protectionism. So I think there's sometimes an argument for having a transitional period during which you actually help those countries go back to where they were before the colonisation happened and before corporates came in and actually took over the whole of the country. You're seeing it happening in countries like Kenya now, where sustainable agriculture is being replaced by huge swathes of land being used to grow flowers that are then being shipped to the UK, the cut flowers that you see sold in petrol stations and supermarkets. So I think sometimes there is a case for protectionism to protect the weaker. On the deregulation point, I mean, I was on the Treasury Select Committee from 2005 till just about the time the financial crisis hit. And I sat there with Tory MPs saying that we were over-regulating and we were over-taxing and we ought to go to the Irish model. And you know what happened to the Celtic Tiger model when the financial crisis hit there. I think that one of the interesting things about going into TTIP on financial services front is actually the UK's financial centre is very different to any of the other European financial centres because we are far more internationalist. We do far more trade all around the world. We're the biggest financial centre in the world. We're actually less regulated than the other countries, and that's something that the UK has fought against. So things like the financial transactions tax, which I think personally would be a very good idea. George Osborne has always held back against the EU pushing for that. So again, it's whether there's scope to actually introduce more regulation if we sign ourselves up to agreements relating to financial services, which so far we've actually evaded.
Thanks, Kerry. I'm going to move on, so we'll get you to come in a wee bit, Nigel, if that's all right, because we've got plenty of stuff. So as Julian's been passing me questions, I think we need to give the secrecy and ISDS part a fair hearing, so that's why I'm keen to move on to that bit, but we'll come in like the next time you speak with stuff you might have said. So there's a whole chunk of questions have come in about ISDS and the secrecy of the negotiations. So as a question, what I'm going to do is ask 3 in one go and then get the panel to react to that cluster of questions, I think, because they're fairly similar. So here's a question from Sam Crutcher. I hope I pronounced that right. It seems that there are clearly some economic benefits of TTIP, but the main provision causing concern is ISDS. ISDS is the ability for companies to sue governments that we talked about earlier. So his or her question, can't we enjoy the economic benefits of TTIP without the ISDS part? So that's question number 1. Relatedly, Louise Somerville-Williams, a very similar sort of question. Would the panel be willing to accept a watered-down version of TTIP with ISDS removed, and what's the likelihood of ISDS being removed? And from Anne Crowley, a quite clear question. Can you clarify whether ISDS does indeed allow corporations to sue our government? And wouldn't the TTIP, including ISDS, be an opportunity to renegotiate this? So a whole load of questions there about, I think the main question there to turn to the panel is, do you have to have the ISDS part of what's proposed in TTIP in order for the economic benefits of TTIP to happen? And would you accept a version of TTIP that didn't have the ISDS in? And I'm going to turn maybe to Nigel, if you want to come in specifically on that, or just to give the MPs a chance to have a think, because you were going to come in and I interrupted you. So if the guys on the right want to say anything in reaction to that, and then we'll bring the MPs back in.
Well, this is one of the real killers of this particular part of TTIP, isn't it? And I actually think the momentum is such now that it looks as if it's dead in the water. Germany has come out against it. Certainly the international trade union movement is against this particular pernicious part of it. And you look around the world at who is suing who, big corporations with lots of money are pursuing governments for very large sums. I mean, we've heard about the tobacco example where Australia and Uruguay are being sued because they've changed the regulations. Egypt was sued because they increased the minimum wage. These sort of examples where corporate lawyers are finding that trade agreements give them scope because we're not pursuing the traditional trade agreements, which are about arguments over tariffs. Once you go down this road about balancing different forms of regulation, then how on earth do you measure the worth of that? And if a democratic state decides to change the regulation for whatever reason, then to be sued by multinational corporations sets a very, very dangerous trend that I think we've got to oppose.
Sam, you look like you're ready to come in. I'll come to Fran after that. Sam?
Okay, I was going to talk about regulation, but I hope to get to talk about that later. ISDS is quite an interesting one in that it actually fails in and of its own right. It's designed to increase foreign direct investment in countries where maybe there would not be so much, but yet they've never found any correlation between having it and actually getting foreign direct investment. Brazil refuses to sign any agreement with ISDS in and has no problem attracting it. So it's a complete waste of time on that front. And you don't have to believe me, the UK government actually commissioned a study from the LSE, which they've now buried on their website because it says completely what they don't want it to. And I'm going to read out the 4 key headings from it. There is little reason to think that an EU-US investment chapter will provide the UK with significant economic benefits. Great. 2, there is little reason to think that a EU-US investment chapter will provide the UK with significant political benefits. Okay. 3, there is some reason to expect an EU-US investment chapter will impose meaningful economic costs on the UK. 4, there is some reason to expect an EU-US investment chapter to impose meaningful political costs on the UK. So my question then is, why is our Trade Minister, Lord Livingston, ignoring this and the wishes of the UK public? Because let's not forget there was just a consultation on this where 50,000 responses came from the UK, the most of any country in Europe. And that's something to think about. Apparently we don't engage on Europe. We sent the most from any country on Europe, which is something to be really proud of, opposing ISDS, yet our trade minister's sending a letter to Juncker saying it better still be in. I mean, what's going on here? I'm confused. Their study says it's rubbish. The people don't want it. What's the point? But just one clear thing. We could have ISDS out, and this would still be a terrible agreement. And I hopefully get to talk about that later.
Thanks, Sam. Fran, up you.
So yeah, I'll just quickly reflect on that. I think my point before was that even if ISDS is out, like the lobbyists, the people like advocating for TTIP, one of the reasons is just to have an even bigger financial sector, which would probably give us an even greater risk of a bigger financial crisis in years to come. And obviously the benefits are quite marginal and uncertain, but the costs are that it basically risks our governments losing the ability to protect citizens because they'll get sued in the ISDS courts, and it puts private interests above public policy. But also on the benefits, I mean, it seems to me like politicians advocating for this agreement think that any pound of growth is a good thing. And I think we've got an issue where we've kind of reduced our economy down to one number, GDP, is it going up or down? And there's no one analysing whether this growth, if there is growth, is good or bad, if the jobs being created are useful jobs that we want versus jobs that we don't want. And just to bring in the positive money angle is actually part of this need for growth at any cost is the way we create money. For every pound in your bank account, there's a pound of debt somewhere else. So if we want more money in the economy, we have to have more debt. And if we want less debt, then we'll have less money. So we have this situation where we can either have growth at any cost, and as we grow our debt levels, our private debt levels, we need further growth to service that debt, or we have a contracting economy and we face unemployment, poverty, and recessions. And actually what we need is more money and less debt and good jobs and not just growth at any cost.
Thank you, Fran. So I'm going to go the other way round, if that's all right, Kerry, to go to you first. And the question was, would you accept TTIP without ISDS in it? I think that's the core of the question.
I think there's a pretty good chance, as has been said, that TTIP will go ahead without ISDS in there. I've spoken to people that have been involved in observing the negotiations, both from the American side and from the EU side. And certainly from the EU side, there's a number of countries, it's not just Germany, that are very opposed to it and have real concerns about this. I think the key thing at the moment is there needs to be more transparency about the discussions that are happening as to whether ISDS will be in there or not. It has been said there are something like 92 bilateral agreements that the UK has with other countries, which already has ISDS in there. And I think there's only been 2 cases that we know of that have been brought under those agreements, and neither of those concerned a challenge to public policy. But just the very fact that when I was looking into this, the phrase, there are only 2 cases that we know of, came up. That should ring alarm bells, because why don't we know if there are any other cases? There shouldn't be this secrecy around it. So, and also I would say that with TTIP, it's a much bigger deal than any bilateral agreements we would have with individual countries. It would cover something like 40% of the world trade. Therefore, the opportunity for corporates to misuse this process is obviously much greater. So, yeah, I think it could go ahead without ISDS. I do think there's a separate issue, which we don't have time to discuss now, which is, aside from this sort of more sort of secret form of dispute settlement, just the sheer power of corporates to challenge things. We see it even on a very local level with planning applications, where McDonald's and Tesco's can challenge people who are trying to bring judicial reviews. It's the balance of the scales of justice are not evenly balanced in that respect at all, and you see that in so many other cases that and this government has tried to remove the right to bring class actions, legal aid for class actions, where British companies were actually affecting swathes of people in other countries, which was, I think, overturned in the House, or they tried to overturn it in the House of Lords. I'm not quite sure where we are with it now, but I think, so what I'm trying to say, probably in a slightly long-winded way, is the abuse of corporate power and using the courts and the justice system to entrench that corporate power isn't just about ISDS, it goes much farther than that.
Thank you, Fran. Molly, would you like to come in? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I mean, one of the questions a way back was whether ISDS will make the agreement less likely. And I think, or whether if ISDS is not in, the agreement will go ahead. And my understanding is the US negotiators have said if ISDS is removed, they'll walk away. So that's very much coming from that side of the Atlantic. And I think we've got to ask ourselves why that's the case. And actually, we've got to go back a step further and say, what is trade in financial services anyway? You know, what's really going on here? And I think it's about freeing up the movement of capital across the world to make the greatest possible profits. And I'm just not convinced that's actually in our interests. It's about corporations wanting to protect their investments no matter where they choose to invest. And here's one example of what might happen. After Fukushima, the German government, as you know, decided to shut down its nuclear power. Hurrah for them, I say. Soon after, Vattenfall, the Swedish utility that operates 2 nuclear plants in Germany, demanded compensation of 3.7 billion and used the ISDS clause on energy investments to do that. So that's the kind of thing you're looking at. A government won't feel free to make decisions about any policy, health policy, energy policy, whatever, because it will fear that there will be a response from corporations and there will be a financial penalty. And TTIP is actually already having this sort of chilling effect on public policy. So key legislative proposals, such as minimum environmental criteria for our fuels, have now been shelved in order to facilitate negotiations with the US. So we're coming under pressure, and it's really undermining our democracy, I think. Is it interesting? I mean, it's already been pointed out that Germany opposes ISDS, but so do France and Italy. The big, confident economies of Europe are opposing this. So why is our government supporting it? I think it's because our government are lackeys of international finance, quite honestly, and I don't think that's in our interest. Oh, I know how to get a round of applause now. I'll try that again. So, and I think the other point to note is that the other countries that are supporting the ISDS clause are small countries like Estonia and Cyprus and so on that absolutely rely on this investment and don't feel that they've got any choice. But we do have a choice, and we shouldn't be allowing this sort of undemocratic clause to go ahead. Now, I sat there in the committee when we examined Juncker, who's now the president of the Commission, and tried to check out whether we thought he'd be a good president and whether we should vote for him. And he said then that he thought ISDS was problematic and it shouldn't be part of the final treaty. But this has actually made me very suspicious, because I think what's going to happen is they're going to offer us a really awful treaty with just an absolutely totally unacceptable bit in it. They'll take that bit out and then we're supposed to accept the treaty. So I'm completely with Sam here. This is a bad treaty, and even if ISDS is removed, it shouldn't go ahead.
Thank you, Molly. And Stephen, just before you answer that, if I may, I'm going to chuck in also, as the resident member of the government around here, I'm going to chuck in also a question from Joe Myers, who asks, is it democratic to even be discussing TTIP in secret? So leaving aside the ISDS part of it. So we have the original question still stands, but also is there something undemocratic about this negotiation process in general?
Well, the difficulty with what Molly just said, and quite obviously it was a popular comment, and all of her comments are getting huge applause, so we can tell where the audience is lying, so I can tell you're probably not going to like me saying this. How can you be against something that hasn't been concluded yet? You say it's a bad treaty. We don't have a treaty yet. We don't know what's in it, because the discussions are still at early stages and haven't come to conclusion yet. So how you can be against something when you don't know what the outcome is, I don't know. But there we are. That's a rational position for you to explain. Now, as to whether the trouble when you reduce something to an acronym of ISDS, it's very easy to then have hostile speeches against it and think, oh yeah, that's terrible, it must be terrible, it's an acronym, without thinking about what it actually is. You just mentioned Estonia. Estonia is a country I visited a couple of times, because I said in my introductory remarks, I'm a passionate Europhile and believe that European Union membership is good for all Europeans. Estonia is one of the hotbeds in the European Union of innovation in high technology. Skype was invented in Estonia. So actually the reason why they might want to have investor confidence is because if a small Estonian company invents something and they try to export it to a country with which Estonia has a treaty relationship, i.e. in this case all other 27 member states of the European Union, and let's just say the British government said, well, actually, we wish a British company had invented Skype. We're going to put a barrier in this way. We're going to say under trading standards, it's all a bit yucky. We're not going to allow it into this country. What's the remedy for that inventor, that innovator who has invented something? It's to sue. And that's the case in all contracts. A treaty is a contract. And if a participant to that contract, in this case a member state, breaks that contract overtly to protect overtly to have economic protectionism, then there has to be some remedy. So that's why the concept exists. And we actually have lots of them in EU existing trade agreements, and it doesn't lead to massive problems. Britain has 92 bilateral direct UK to some other country trade agreements which have one of these in it, and it doesn't lead to the problems that have been described. But the question was that if we think that having a way for investors to settle a trade dispute does become toxic and should be outside, then I say yes, it should. Health campaigning has been mentioned several times. Before I was a government minister, I was chair of the cross-party committee in Parliament on smoking and public health. Anti-tobacco campaigning is my oldest political interest. Some of you may have heard me say this before over the years. I am hated by Imperial Tobacco, by Philip Morris, by JIT, and all the other international companies, and I've been on the receiving end of their online trolling by anonymous people, sock puppets, whatever. So I know what it's like to be bullied by a big corporation. But I'm proud of the fact that I helped persuade our government to go down the road of going through standardised packaging of cigarettes, even though we knew Philip Morris was suing the Australian government at that moment. The British government has decided to do that because it's in the interests of public health that we do. And no treaty is going to stop us regulating inside the United Kingdom if we think there is a public policy benefit at the outcome of that. The government has been clear we should be able to regulate in society's interests, whatever the treaty says, and the European Commission has said pretty much the same. But if I thought for 1 minute, the likes of Philip Morris, which is the most common company that is mentioned, and all the flyers I've seen about this, one of which came to my letterbox, I thought for 1 minute the power of Philip Morris, or Imperial for that matter, based in this city, was enhanced by having this, I would certainly vote against it.
Thanks. Charlotte, last word on this to you. How would you react to the issues around secret courts and ISDS and the secrecy of the process in general?
I think it's always right to look at the worst case scenario when you're negotiating anything or putting anything together. I think it's something that governments often don't do very well, and they assume that big corporates are nice, benevolent organisations and it's all going to be fine. And we know it's not. So I think it's absolutely right to be very cautious. But I think we have to be cautious and look at worst case scenarios in context and look at the protection that it may, if it was properly and well negotiated and the provisions in there were good, may be able to provide. If the ISDS was taken out of TTIP, would it go ahead? To be honest, I don't know. I feel like there's too much uncertainty over the concept of TTIP at the moment to be able to give you a reasonable answer. And in short, I think any regulation has to be done well. Whatever the regulation is, if it's not done well and it's done naively and it doesn't look at worst case scenarios, it's not going to be good, but we need to be able to get mutual protection right.
Okay, all right, thank you. We're going to move on to our next chunk of questions, and these issues will keep coming back up again. And what it says up there is what sort of growth. Now, what we were trying to get at with these questions is that the people who support TTIP, of which there are some on the panel, will tell you that TTIP is a way to deliver jobs and growth. And as I think Fran alluded to earlier on, there are a lot of people who say, well, is that the right sort of growth? Should we be pursuing growth? Even if this treaty does deliver growth, does that mean we should necessarily back it? There's a specific question here on Twitter, actually, that's come from AntQ, I think, which says TTIP will promote globalization, and indeed that's where a lot of the jobs come from global trade. So what do the panel see as the end destination of globalization? Where does this go? So that's maybe a question to think about, but I'd like to ask you all whether you think even if TTIP just delivered £100 of growth or £250 of growth, would it still be worth doing? How much growth does it have to deliver for you in order for you not to be worried about the negative consequences of it? And what we're going to do is just see if anyone wants to react to that on the panel. I'm going to get a bit pithier with time on the panel because we're running a bit short. So, Molly, would you like to go? Yeah.
Always got something to say. Sorry, rent a gob again. Yeah, I think the growth advantages of the TTIP treaty have been hugely exaggerated, and I'm not alone in thinking that. When this first came out, my own local MP, Neil Carmichael, put something in the local paper saying there'd be £400 of benefit for each family from TTIP. So I immediately asked him for the maths behind that. Not only because it seemed like a suspiciously round number, but also because since we don't know what the agreement's going to have in it, how can that calculation possibly have been done? So I'm deeply suspicious. There's a whole load of kind of modelling that goes on behind the scenes, and I'm not convinced that the growth figures hold water. The Centre for Economic Policy Research has produced some work that the Commission actually paid for itself, so it was expected to be in favour of the treaty. But it said that the EU economy could benefit by up to 119 billion. But Friends of the Earth have complained about that because it's actually a one-off figure, and they correctly identified that this has been suggested that this is an annual figure, whereas the modelling showed it was just going to happen the once. So I think the benefits have been overstated, but I'm also wanting to broaden this out a bit and ask who growth is actually benefiting these days. Is having a bigger economy our main priority? I would say no. I would say the main priority is sharing the proceeds of economic activity more fairly. I think that as we're coming under pressure as consumers to sort of constantly buy new stuff, and the products we've got are poor quality and wear out and are made in sweatshops and have to be thrown away and have to be replaced all the time. And I don't know about you, but I find this quite a pressure just sort of keeping up, quite honestly. And as employees, as people who go to work, we're not getting fair wages, and more of the value is going to the elites and the richest people in society while wages are being cut for everybody else. And obviously this economic growth, this economic activity is putting a huge pressure on the planet as we take more resources and we use more energy, and it's one of the key drivers behind carbon emissions and the fact that we're not able to tackle climate change. And just in terms of the relationship between trade and growth, I mean, just because we are now exchanging more things with the US, how does that increase the number of shoes you need to wear? I really don't see the logic in that. You know, I'm still only going to be wearing one pair of shoes, so it's either going to be made here or it's going to be made in the US. I don't want actually to have more than one pair of shoes at a time, and I don't want to have to be forced to do more shopping just to keep economic growth going.
Thank you, Molly. Sam, I know, wants to come in, so nice and short, please, Sam, you can react to that.
Okay, first, I've been just monitored the Twitter feed, and it's nice to see people engaging. Someone did ask a question, how can you bury a report on the website? If it's on a website, good question. You try and find it without me having told you about it, would be my answer. In terms of the economic growth, this is interesting. I've actually spent a lot of time looking at this, and you can break it down, as Molly has, in terms of the fact that all the assumptions underlying it are a load of nonsense, like the fact that there's full employment in the Eurozone. That's the base assumption of this entire model that they've used to get this 10 billion a year. So I don't know about you, but I haven't seen that. So it can be broken down on its own right. It's 10 billion a year from 2027 onwards. I can't predict the future. I haven't seen an economist successfully predict the future to next month yet, so I'm a bit confused about that. But if you break that down annually, that's an increase of 0.035% over the next 12 years or so up till then. That's nothing more than a rounding error. They're making this up. However, if I just said about the assumptions, there's some other things. The other assumption is that companies instantly reinvest profits into new jobs and everything, rather than just pay dividends to their shareholders. Well, I've not been seeing much of that lately either. But some people did do a study that actually looked at this, used the same model as the CEPR, the guys from the European Commission, but just decided to look at it a bit differently and take some base assumptions from the Eurozone and actually, apply them, like the fact there's unemployment. And it came out with some different statistics. Over 10 years, the average work in Britain would be worse off to the tune of £3,300. Europe would lose around 600,000 jobs, and there'd be more inequality as wages fall in proportion to growth in rent, interest and dividend payments. Any of you who've read Thomas Piketty will understand that argument quite well. So I still think economic forecasting is an absolute load of nonsense, but it is interesting when you start to take into account the economic realities of the Eurozone, because it's not looking as good.
Thank you, Sam. Nigel and Fran, did you guys want to come in? Thanks.
I think there's some fundamental contradictions going on, including the philosophy behind TTIP. They expect you to have poor workers but rich consumers. The squeeze on wages means that we can't see any sort of sustainable growth, but also the privatised, fragmented model affects almost everything we do. Even from retrofitting and energy conservation, you can't do it on a fragmented, privatised model. You've got to do it through your local council intervening to give proper support. We can't have a proper transport network without renationalising our railways. The same applies in our energy markets, where eventually we are going to be subsidising the French government thanks to the control of EDF. I'll leave Fran to talk about the finance sector, but the same certainly applies to our banking sector. So I think we can talk about sustainable growth, yes, but it's got to be on the basis of increasing earnings, proper public safeguards, and proper standards for working people.
Thank you, Nigel.
Just a quick one on, looking at this trade deal. I guess it's good to look at the growth other trade deals that are similar have brought to those areas. The North America NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Deal, that's actually costs almost 1 million jobs and increased poverty in Mexico, when again they were promised like all of these amazing numbers, the increase in wealth for every member of North America. So I think that it's really dangerous to think that it's going to bring growth. And then, of course, I agree with the other comments that made by Molly and Sam, Nigel, about what growth we want. I mean, I want everyone in this room to be able to do gardening all day and not buy shoes and it not to crash the economy.
Thanks, Fran. So, of the remaining MPs who'd like to jump in on this? Yeah, go for it, Charlotte. Thank you.
Globalisation. I mean, I think there are concerns with globalisation, but I think we have to acknowledge it is a fact, and we do live in a global market and a global economy, and it's a question of how we regulate that, not whether we don't want it to exist or not. I just think that's not a realistic option. When we talk about growth, there was a question asked earlier, which is absolutely right. Growth of what? And I think one thing that may have been underestimated in this is that it's SMEs, small businesses who don't have massive legal departments, who can otherwise negotiate their way through foreign investment, who would actually benefit disproportionately from this. And here in Bristol, one of the great things about being an MP is I've seen massive green technology innovations going on in Bristol. And if we do this well, those are exactly the kind of embryonic companies and organisations with green ideas when people are going to be, countries are going to be looking to alternative energy forms because fossil fuels will run out, that will be able to make the most of this. And of course, once those innovative small organisations take off, they can then employ people, that's more jobs. They won't have to spend as much money on complex legal battering rams to get into other countries, so they'll be able to pay their workers more wages. I think there are upsides to this that it's certainly worth balancing against the fears and the concerns that are obviously very relevant in this room.
Thank you. Yes, Charlotte, that's fine. Thank you. Stephen, after you.
Well, growth, I think, is a good thing. Choose your metaphor. John Kennedy said, on the rising tide, more boats will float. If you have a bigger cake, more people can have more pieces to be shared round. So expanding the national economy does, and increasing the overall wealth of the economy, has the potential to benefit everything. And the reason I say it has the potential, that's when the policy choice comes in. How do you share out that growing economy? And indeed, what sort of growth is it? Now, it seems to be the position of Molly and the Green Party that growth is absolutely bad. Now, I'm quite curious about that, because I think where a lot of the economic growth from the future will come from will be dealing with what Friends of the Earth colleagues at the end of the panel said, dealing with the big challenge facing this generation of politicians. How do we deal with climate change? I think climate change is a moral thing, that there is a moral reason why we have to deal with it, but actually there is an economic benefit from dealing with it as well. One of my responsibilities as the Communities Minister is regulating houses. So, for instance, I have decided that houses built from April this year will have to be built to tougher insulation standards. I've decided from 2016 that there'll have to be even tougher insulation standards with triple glazing, wall insulation, most energy efficient boiler, and so on. Now the question is, that will lead to growth. Who is going to make it? Is it going to be made here, or are they going to be made in China? I would rather these products were made within the United Kingdom or within the European Union. So if more people are employed installing triple glazed windows, more people are employed manufacturing energy efficient boilers, that's growth. That's what it is. That is economic growth. But it's good economic growth, which I think most people in this room would like to see. Well, you just said we don't need TTIP. The question was, are you in favour of growth and what sort of growth? So I thought we'd moved on from TTIP itself. But yeah. I was answering specifically about growth.
That's fair, I think, in this context, but we're not done with TTIP, worry not. Kerry, do you want to wrap this section up?
I think
growth in what? Growth for who?
Just very quickly, I think that any focus on growth, sustainability has absolutely got to be at the heart of it, whether it's about using natural resources, whether it's about what I was saying about overconsumption and the pressures that puts on consumers. Obviously, the issue of cartels. Yeah, we saw with the whole deregulation and privatisation movement of the 1980s that was meant to stimulate the economy. What it basically meant is you have monopolies, whether it be over public transport with the bus deregulation. I don't know why I can't speak today, sorry, it's been a long day. The bus deregulation, the big six controlling the energy supplies, which Labour has said it'll have a review of the energy market. So I think where I would like to see the growth occur, and it partly goes back to what Stephen was saying. I met OVO Energy the other day, employs 550 people in Bristol, has now got 1.7% of the energy market. It's companies like that I want to see growing and taking a greater share, and that's not necessarily growth overall, that's growth in enabling other people to enter the market. I also think looking at it outside just a sort of Little England or just a British approach, if you look at world growth, the key issue is about spreading the riches. There's countries that are moving out from being the poorest countries in the world, being classed as middle-income countries, but yet there is still massive inequality of wealth. I think, India has a population of like 1.1 billion, and people question why we would still give international aid to a country like India. It's because 900 million of them are still living in absolute abject poverty, and yet the Indian government is running a space program. So there's still, so factored into that sustainability, equality, and the points that Nigel made about it. Again, this lifting standards, ensuring that it's not at the expense of, if growth is about companies making a lot more money and workers suffering as a result, then that's obviously not what we should be supporting. But I think there are ways with the international mechanisms, whether it's through the ILO, whether it's through treaties, that we can address some of these issues. I don't accept the sort of defeatism that we walk away from it and just try to do our own thing. I think it is important that we do engage on the international stage and try to cement that. We want to bring more people into the fold so that they adhere to these standards, rather than just saying, well, we're turning our back on all of that.
Thank you. So I want to we were due to finish at 6. Well, we're actually due to finish slightly earlier, but we ran on. It's now 10 to 6, and I've got lots of stuff to get through. Can anyone on the panel stay till 10 past 6? Is that okay to push on a wee bit? You have to go. Okay, well, Charlotte may have to leave us, but if it's all right to push on slightly after 6, just to make sure we crack on with this, then that's fine. We're already running over, so that's our problem. In which case, Charlotte. Right. So these are questions about specifics. These are things that you guys have fed into us, either on Twitter or in the room, about specific issues around TTIP that you have concerns with. What I'm going to do is rattle through a lot of these. And we'll ask the panel to pick up on the things that are specifically of interest to them, they feel they have something to say on, and I guess anything they don't address, I guess you can read into yourself. So we have a question here from Raman Yusuf, who says, Egypt is being sued for increasing its minimum wage. Is that the future for the UK thanks to TTIP? Question here that might be best for Fran, but it's a question, I'm not sure who this is from. Financial sector regulations are stricter in the USA than in the EU, so how will TTIP affect that? Another question, how will TTIP, something Kerry was talking about, how does TTIP affect the distribution of wealth and not the amount of it? So does it get us to be a fairer society? And a couple of questions that are the ones that I hear the most perhaps said about in my dealings with TTIP. So number one is about the NHS. And it's a direct question actually for the MPs on the panel. Will you vote to exclude the NHS from TTIP? And actually let's take that one on the nose first so that no one gets to leave before that happens. So for the 4 MPs only, will you vote to exclude the NHS from TTIP?
Shall I go first and just say no? Sorry, yes. Yes, sorry. I meant yes. I mean, that's absolutely fundamentally a red line, and we're trying to get assurances, and if there's any doubt, then we would not support it. So let me get my words in the right order. Like I said, it's been a really long day, really long week, but yeah, we want to make absolutely sure that the NHS isn't threatened by TTIP.
Can I go next? I want to go next because I want to raise 2 questions with the government people we've got sitting here, because I want to be clear about their position on privatisation of the NHS. We can get an exclusion of sectors such as health from this treaty negotiation, and lots of countries have done that in the case of health, but our government hasn't. And I'd like to ask them why not. And I think I've said already that there's the kind of combined threat of the ISDS and the openness of our health market. Most governments totally eschew the profit motive in health, and so they do not allow private sector providers into health in the way that we've done in this country. And this has been done through the Health and Social Care Act and against the wishes of the people of this country. And in fact, the Conservative government pledged that there would be no major reorganisation of the health service, and then went ahead and did exactly that. And I think it's that sort of thing. It's that sort of thing that brings the government and brings politics into disrepute, I'm afraid. So I'd like to ask the two government representatives here whether they voted in favour of the Health and Social Care Act, because I think that's crucial as well, because that opens us up, opens our market up.
Thank you, Molly. So, let's, Charlotte, so you get your say before you have to go. Do you want to come in?
I've checked with. I can stay till 10 past.
Okay. So Steve.
I know I'm not let off the hook, but
I don't mind which of you goes first.
I'm happy to go first.
Okay, go for it. Yeah, thank you.
I think at the bottom of the NHS debate and the privatisation debate is a basic difference in values. I've asked someone who came to see me, would they rather their nan, for example, was more likely to die in a in a completely state-monopolised NHS? This is a thought experiment. No, this is a thought experiment. If it remained state-run, or would they be more open to a variety of providers if it meant that it was safer? And they said they prefer a state provider. Now that's fine. That's not an opinion that I share. I do think that if a provider is good, I'm not wedded to the fact that they have to be a state provider if they're good or better. So that's where I come from. However, I think privatisation in the NHS has not had a happy history. My dad's a surgeon, and I remember how concerned he was with the independent sector treatment centres coming in the early 2000s, because they essentially cream-skimmed all the easy patients and left all the difficult ones for the NHS and didn't provide any training for the junior doctors and got paid regardless of how many operations they did. Now, that was in no way a level playing field, and I'm very, very concerned about that. And there are aspects of privatisation in our public services, the NHS one of them, which I have concerns about, because the public sector has not been very good at negotiating with the private sector. But if we get it right and we get better providers in to provide services free at the point of need based on need, not ability to pay, I personally don't have a problem with that. I know there are people who are, and I respect that, but I personally don't. Since we don't actually know what TTIP is going to be and what's going to be in it, it's hard to answer the question accurately on exempting the NHS from that. But I would certainly vote to keep our sovereignty over the providers within the NHS, and it's going to be down to GP commissioners to decide who provides those services. Now, if a GP commissioner thinks that a foreign firm is going to provide better care for their patients at a lower price, I would not want to stand in the way of that. I know people may disagree, but I have to be honest about where I stand.
Stephen, over to you. Thanks, Charlotte. Stephen, over to you. Thanks. Okay, thanks for... I'm sorry, we can't. Thank you very much. We can't take comments. I'd love to. Stephen, would you like to react?
I think it's actually already quite clear, but I'm quite happy to talk to colleagues in government to make it emphatically clear that decision-making about the National Health Service or any other part of our sort of social policy, our social welfare, whether it's pensions, social security, whatever, simply doesn't lie within the competence of the European Union at all and should not be a factor of this treaty. So I'm perfectly clear about that. Now, we changed from an interesting point where one of the participants on the panel has now decided to chair the discussion as well, but as she's asked the question about whether the 2012 Act was a good thing, are you in favour of family doctors making decisions about how to procure healthcare in Bristol, or would you rather it was civil servants who you don't know? Are you in favour of Bristol City Council, elected Bristol City Councillors and clinicians sitting on a health and wellbeing board so they can plan together how you integrate healthcare, social care in our city? Are you in favour of the City of Bristol deciding lots of policy on public health, on things like how you deal with drugs, alcohol and dependence on tobacco in our city? I would have thought most people would probably think those were rationally good things. And that bill did all three of those, and there were things that actually my party wanted and said that we wanted in the 2010 general election, to have more local control and more professionally led decision-making over our healthcare, rather than Andy Burnham, Andrew Lansley, whoever it happens to be, pulling the levers in Whitehall and making all the decisions from everywhere to Christchurch to Bristol. It's not been privatised at all. This is okay, where Steve, this is where politics becomes irrational. Who has bought shares in the National Health Service? Put your hand up if you're a shareholder in the National Health Service. It has not been privatised.
Okay.
Not been privatised at all. It is still there. I am an NHS patient myself at Southmead Hospital for my own neurological neurological condition. The NHS has not been privatised. I have my treatment free.
We're going to move on. We're going to move on.
You can heckle all you like, but you don't have the facts on your side.
Now, look, I've had a specific audience comment here, and I'm not making this up, that says they want to hear more from Sam. So I'm going to ask, there was a question I was going to ask anyway, and I'm going to ask Sam to come to it first in that case. And this is going to be the last question before we wrap up at the end, because we're very low on time. And the question is from Louise Somerville-Williams, again, and it says, please can the panel explain how TTIP will further the unconventional oil and gas extraction agenda, which is shale gas and shale oil to you and I, fracking, and what methods will be left for communities to object if it does? And it's fine to say if you don't know.
Good question. Well, if the European Union is successful in getting the US to remove their obstructions at the moment to exporting liquefied natural gas, that will lead to them producing more liquefied natural gas around the US. So that's the first way it expands it. And I suppose the question was maybe to do with ISDS. I mean, there's the example of Lone Pine Resources suing the Canadian government, the province of Quebec, for putting in a moratorium on fracking. Will that be able to happen in the UK? Yeah, of course it will under ISDS. Will it stop governments from doing it anyway? Well, I've heard not, but I mean, we can make our own minds up about that. I'd also just like to rattle through a few things, because I've heard SMEs mentioned a lot. Around 60% of international trade is within multinational companies. I don't see so much room for SMEs there. Also, one of the big examples was used, a small company from Estonia could then use ISDS to back up, to sort of enforce their intellectual property or whatever. Do you know how expensive ISDS is? It would bankrupt an SME. They'd have no chance of using it. Okay, and also we've also heard that the agreement should be sustainable. 18 months in, they still haven't published their sustainable impact assessment by the European Commission, so it's clearly not that big a deal.
Thanks, Sam. Does anyone specifically want to comment on fracking and oil and gas in general? That's fine if you do. Molly's looking like she might.
I'll just quickly say that we're trying to get a banning resolution across the whole of Europe. We're signed up to the callback resolution, and although some countries, sadly our own, are opposing that, we are fighting the hardest we can to get fracking banned, and then we wouldn't need to fight the individual battles on the ground.
Thanks, man. Okay, thank you, sir. Thanks, sir.
Labour tabled amendments to the infrastructure bill in the Lords the other day. The Green peer didn't even turn up and didn't submit anything either. So, I think the Greens are in a very easy position in terms of taking certain positions in that, but we do need your support in the House of Lords as well as anywhere else.
We've only got one peer, so she's rather busy. Give us a few more and then they'll be there.
But if you think you're saying this is one of your totemic issues. I mean, Caroline Lucas works very hard, so I was saying that we need your support in the Lords as well.
Okay. Anything else on the panel specifically about climate, oil and gas, fracking? And what we're going to do in that case, this is the wrap-up section. What I'm going to do is ask everyone to say anything they feel they need to get off their chest that they haven't already. Not you lot, these guys. And ask them a simple question, which is, if you were in charge of the ISDS process, the TTIP process, if the whole thing was entirely up to you, what would you do? Would you do it exactly as it's being done now? Would there be particular things you'd insist on? Would you tear it up and start again? What should the people in this room understand as your driving motivation for what should happen to TTIP? And I'm going to start with Charlotte, if that's all right.
I think done right, it could be a great opportunity. Done wrong, it could be damaging. What I'd like to do is take what we're very proud of, what's the very best of what we've done in Britain and in Europe, and set the standard, and not only say to the USA, you must do this, but illustrate why it's the best thing to do long term. Everyone really has got an incentive in their own interest in the long term, and doing the right thing for the planet has got to be doing the right thing for every country long term. We need to make that case a little bit better.
Thanks. Do jump in, Stephen, or anyone else wishes to go before him, that's fine.
Yeah, as I was saying right at the very start, we are members of the world's largest trading entity, the European Union. We are not the weak people in this discussion, in this debate, in this negotiation with the second biggest single market in the world. And one of the things that's slightly despair me, you said you would get something off your chest, is the sort of inbuilt assumption amongst quite clearly quite a few people in this room that somehow all the people who are currently involved in this debate, whether it's the British politicians you have in front of you, whether it's President Hollande, whether it's Chancellor Merkel or anybody else, are engaged in some collective sellout of every European citizen. And I simply don't... Well, obviously some of you think that, and I can tell that. I simply do not think that is the case. And even if they do have ulterior motives, they're in a stronger position to get their ulterior motives than the United States. The United States, just for once here, is not holding the whip hand in these negotiations. We are, as Europeans. That is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to get this right for the benefit of our part of the planet, but also for the benefit of America as well. And because if the European Union, oh, that's very clever, isn't it? I hope you feel better for that. If the European Union and the United States together do manage to get a trade deal that has lots of standardization, has higher standards. Again, we should not assume this is a race to the bottom. It is an opportunity to raise American standards to our level. That actually sets the template for the rest of the world as well, because the rest of the world collectively deals either with the United States or with us. So I think it's an opportunity, not a threat. We're at early stages, and obviously all of us, as you would rightly expect, will be monitoring how it turns out. But I don't think we should be so pessimistic or cynical about what the outcome should be.
We've got 1 minute each remaining.
Okay, Steve kind of criticised me by implication just now for chairing the debate, but I don't think I was trying to chair the debate. I was trying to make our representatives accountable by asking them how they voted on a particular issue. And they haven't answered, so I assume they both voted in favour. But I must say I admire them coming here and making themselves accountable in front of such a rowdy audience, so I have to give them that. Steve also asked me what sort of growth we want. I don't think that's a rhetorical question. I think it's a question that's got a very simple answer, and the answer is growth now that will mean we need less growth in the future, and particularly in terms of our energy use. So I think we need to be investing now in the sort of system Steve was talking about, but that mean in future we won't need to use so much energy. So we may need growth, for example, insulating homes, putting up wind turbines and so on, because eventually that will mean we're producing less carbon dioxide, and I'm sure we agree about that actually. In this context, though, where we disagree is that I think trade is very wasteful of energy. What I'm trying to achieve is that we get the best possible human well-being and happiness for the minimum input of energy. And to me, just shipping things around the world is a terrible waste of energy in that context. And just on the question of what I would do instead, we've got a proposal for a general agreement on sustainable trade, which is much more focused on local production for local use. I think we should aim to keep the high standards we've negotiated in Europe and try to share those with the rest of the world. And the way to do that would be to charge people who wanted to enter the single market a tariff on their goods if they didn't reach our standards, whether that's animal welfare or carbon dioxide emission standards. So I think in that way we could not only protect our own standards but also start to share them with the rest of the world.
Thanks, Mark. Kerry, in 1 minute, if you can.
I think the turnout today, and there's never going to be enough time to do the debate justice, but I think it just does highlight how much concern there is out there about this relentless drive for growth and the consequences of globalisation, whether it be on the environmental front. We've got the climate change talks coming to a head in Paris 2015. The next stage of the talks is in Lima in Peru this December. And I worry a great deal that if you go back to before David Cameron got elected, climate change was very much on the political agenda. I get very, very few emails about that now. So I would urge people to not just focus their attention on TTIP, and particularly on the ISDS element, which I suspect might turn out to be a bit of a red herring, in that I think someone else said before that you focus all your attention on ISDS being wrong, and then that's dropped from the agreement, and you find out that the rest of the agreement hasn't been scrutinised and has got other things in there that are of concern that people just haven't paid attention to. And I would urge people who are concerned about the NHS, there's a bill being put forward on Friday the 21st of this month by Labour's climate effort to try to repeal the Health and Social Care Act insofar as it paves the way for privatisation. It was really frustrating when that bill went through, in that so few people contacted me about it, and I think because it was quite a complicated issue, I got several hundred emails urging me to go and speak about puppies being sold in pet shops recently, and far more than I got on the NHS. So I would urge people that are concerned, the TTIP battle is one that needs to be fought, and we need to try to get the best deal that we can. But in the short term, you've got the NHS bill on the 21st of November, you've got the climate change talks where the EU is going to it in quite a strong negotiating position, but we need to win over the US, India, China, countries like Australia and Canada that are just in a hideous place on climate change at the moment. So there are those battles. If you care about these issues, those battles are battles that need to be fought as well.
Thank you, Kerry. Fantastic. And in a sentence, what would you do if you were in charge of TTIP? We're very short on time now.
Trade unions are about collective power in work to try and give people better say in a workplace. But we recognised early on that wasn't going to ever be enough. You need regulation alongside that. But regulation alone isn't enough. Talk to a 0 hours contract worker about regulation, how you enforce it. But also, regulation just in a nation state's not enough, because it can be undermined by the power of multinational corporations. So we do need international agreements, but we need our governments to be speaking up for the people, protecting the highest standards, not undermining them on behalf of the corporates of the world.
Thanks. Fran?
I just want to quickly respond to Stephen's point about us being pessimistic and that we should all just not worry because we haven't seen what's in there. I mean, the point is all these negotiations are happening in secret. The only things we know is because they've been leaked. And we're scared about them and because we don't know what's in them. And so just tell us we're being pessimistic is really patronising. And there's a good quote, which is, you can't fight fear with darkness, and that's what's happening right now. So just quickly on the US, they don't want the financial sector in it because they have higher regulations than the EU, and they're scared the EU will try and weaken their regulations, which I think kind of speaks to what TTIP is all about. And I do think that we're worried about it so much because essentially we want regulation to protect citizens who are the most vulnerable, and TTIP is happening in secret, and we don't know what's going on. So I'll just finish with a plug for Positive Money is trying to get a democratic debate happening around money creation, and for all of you to email your MP and tell them to go on the 20th November, and a plea to these MPs to go along and take part in a democratic debate about a really important subject.
Thank you, Fran. And it's just occurred to me that the people who said they wanted more Sam might have actually been your mum and dad, mightn't they? Anyway, more Sam. Sam, you get the final word.
They want far less of me. No, I'm joking. They're lovely. So I would agree with some of what I've heard here, that the EU is going in to the climate change negotiations with a strong position, although I would question how TTIP fits into that position, given that it will potentially lock us into a carbon-intensive future when we start importing all these tar sand oils and liquefied natural gas. So I think maybe the trade negotiators need to have a bit of a conversation with the climate negotiators and stop asking for that bit. And, okay, so in terms of, we've heard quite a lot about regulation today, and we've sort of heard it sort of discussed in the abstract as if we don't know anything about it, but we actually, you asked for more of me, sorry.
Only 30 seconds more, please.
So we do have some things. We've seen the draft proposal from the EU on sanitary and phytosanitary negotiations. That sounds very boring. It actually means food safety, and it's the different standards between the two. So their proposal would have that we would have a system of mutual recognition where we would recognise that the US's standards on food are the same as ours, so that when we import them, we would have less expensive port of entry inspections because we trust them. That is fine if their standards are the same on food safety. However, they are not. And we also know from these leaked documents that there's proposals for a regulatory cooperation council in the future. Again, that sounds boring. What that means, it does not mean that governments can't make their own laws, but it does mean that when governments make their laws, it goes to this council where people look at it, businesses get involved to look at it, and those laws get made in a manner that is least restrictive to trade. There's a conflict here, as I've already discussed. What happened with the Fuel Quality Directive? It's still happening, however, it's been weakened to allow in tar sands. This is not a big bang deregulation. There's some of the scare stories have been about that. It's not. It's just a complete move in the wrong direction. TTIP has been billed as a deal for the 21st century. I would rather say it's the death throes of the last.
Very good. Everyone, please give a round of applause to the panel who have been very brave, some of them. We thank you for coming today. All of the organisations involved, I just want to say a thank you. I'm from Friends of the Earth. Thank you to Positive Money, Ecotricity, 38 Degrees, who've all been very supportive. Thank you to our team of volunteers taking pictures, taking notes, to Julian and Tim, who were the organisers of this wonderful event. Thank you to the venue, and thank you to you all for coming. And now do please go through, are you going to talk about that bit, Tim? Or yeah, Tim could do that bit. Thank you for me. Thank you for a great session. Cheers.
Yep, hi ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for coming. I think the most important thing to take from this event is to talk about TTIP. We need to make sure that lots of these events happen nationwide. If you have family and friends that don't live in Bristol, we need to get as many of these events organised across the country as possible just to talk more about TTIP. The pros, the cons, get the word out there.